introduce our topic, which is an update about coffee leaf rust in Kona, but more generally issues that you have with Kona coffee, which a biologist can reply to. Dr. Melissa Johnson is a research biologist at USDA Ag Research Service, the location in Hilo, which is also known as PBARC. Dr. Johnson and I have worked together on the subject area of how to deal with pests and diseases through tree health, for example. And I think that she'll now have a chance to share her experience regarding CLR as the focus, but also things like CBB, and maybe we can even open it up to research on pests like coffee twig borer beetle, for example. So we'll deal with questions in the order that they're shared via chat is my idea. Otherwise, I'm going to have to be calling on raised hands, which is harder. So that is, again, what I asked you to do. So please chime in as it goes. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her. Aloha, Dr. Johnson. Welcome.
Thank you, Kolhar. That's a very nice introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this late Thursday afternoon. I hope you're all well. First off, can everyone hear me and see the screen okay? Just give me a thumbs up, nod your head if it looks all right. Okay, great. I'm going to put it into presenter view. That still look okay for everyone? Okay, great. Yeah, so as Kolhar mentioned, I'm a research biologist at USDA PBARC, location in Hilo, but I've been working on coffee now since 2017. My background's actually in botany. But I have a real interest in sustainable agriculture in particular, and of course, coffee pests and diseases. It's really intriguing work, and I'm so happy to be involved in all of this and hopefully lend you a helping hand in managing these pests and diseases that you're dealing with on a daily basis. So today, as Kolhar mentioned, it's going to be a little bit of a presentation. I think I'll probably talk for about 18-20 minutes, and then we're going to open up to questions. I really want this to be more informal and really just a chance for you to see what we've been working on, see what some of the trends are, see what some of the control options are. And then it's really a chance for you to get some of your questions answered, any issues that you might be seeing on your farm that I haven't addressed or that are unclear. Please feel free to ask afterwards. So I'll get right into it, and I'm going to start my talk going over some of the trends that we're seeing in CLR incidents across districts and elevation. And I realize that this is a Kona Coffee Growers Association, but I'm going to show you some data from Ka'u and also Hilo as well, just to kind of put it into perspective, the trends that we're seeing across the island as a whole. If you're unfamiliar with the term incidence, it really just means presence of those yellow lesions that are shown in the pictures there. Most of you are probably very familiar with them. They just look like a yellow round spot on the top surface of the leaf, but if you flip the leaf over, you should see these powdery orange spots. And they increase as the season goes on. You'll see more and more of them. So that picture on the very corner shows a leaf completely covered in these powdery orange spores. It's really what we want to avoid. We don't want to see that at the end of the season. So again, CLR incidents, it's just think of it as presence. So that top graph shows you the data that we've been collecting on incidents for the last 3 years. So you know that CLR showed up on the Big Island in late 2020, and pretty much immediately after that, we started asking around to our core group of growers, can we come out and start monitoring for rust on your farms? Because we knew that this was such a terrible disease, and we knew that we needed to catch it quickly. So we started monitoring in January of 2021. So that is the blue line on the top graph. You could see it started out really low. That first season really wasn't too bad until we hit about July, and then we saw the incidence really start to skyrocket. And this was all across Kona. It really seemed to start out kind of at mid elevations, but sure enough, spread to low and high elevations as well. We got into 2022 and started out the year quite high, around 30% incidence. It then fell down through the spring months and into summer. And then again, we saw it start to shoot up about July, August or so, and we ended the year quite high at 30% incidence. What's really interesting, you see the green line, 2023, we're almost mirroring the path that we took last year. So I think we're starting to see what is going to be the typical trend for CLR in Kona. It's going to probably start out pretty high in the beginning of the year, what's left over from the previous season, drop down into March and April as we get that new leaf flush, and then stays pretty low through the summer months. And then as we get into harvest, it's going to start taking off again. And this is what we've seen across farms. The graph there on the right shows differences among elevations. And what you can see is there's really not that much of a difference between low, mid, and high elevations. It was a little surprising at first. We thought maybe wetter areas up at higher elevations would be more affected. But if you think about it, where we grow coffee on the Big Island is really quite a narrow elevation range compared to other coffee growing regions around the world. And if you've looked into the literature at CLR, they might usually talk about it being worse at low elevations, but their low elevation is really high, thousands of feet compared to where we are. So we're in a pretty narrow band and we're not seeing much difference among elevations. Conditions are pretty favorable for CLR regardless of where your farm is. Okay, so then if we look at Ka'u, they're kind of in a little bit of a different situation. They really did not get rust until late 2021. And so we see the graph 2022, it was pretty low, but just like in Kona, it started to increase around July, August. So that same trend increasing through harvest. They started the year out really high because last year was so bad. And now their numbers have started to decrease. However, I think this is a little bit misleading because a lot of farms have actually stumped recently because it's gotten so bad out there. And so that's sort of what that secondary decrease is. Really, the farms that haven't stumped, they are starting to see an increase through harvest, just like you all are in Kona. So I think the general message from this first slide is that there is a characteristic trend in CLR incidence across the whole island. It may be a little bit different between Kona and Ka'u because you have different sort of seasonal, you have weather differences. But all in all, I think we're always going to see the year start out high, dip down through the summer months, and then increase into harvest. We've also been following leaf loss over time. Again, it started out maybe around 15 leaves per branch in 2021 for Kona. I can tell you that we had extensive data before rust came, and the average leaves per branch for Kona was more like 20. So if you look at this graph, you can see that Kona farms have roughly lost 30 to 50% of their leaves over time, which is pretty drastic. You can see the green bars, which is 2023, shows that now we're starting to recover some of those leaves. So we're seeing a little bit of a recovery, but we are not yet at levels to what we were prior to the arrival of rust. So of course, there are impacts on yield. We estimate that 2022, a lot of farms, some maybe only saw 25% loss, but a lot of farms saw up to 75% loss in yields. So it was a terrible year last year. We expect that this year should be better. And you can really see that difference even just driving around Kona. And I think some of that speaks to the quicker response with the different agencies, but I think a lot of it is that growers have really, sought answers to their questions and are really seeking out different ways to manage this disease and have really picked up good information along the way. And I'll get more into that, but I think coffee plant health is really at the core of this. Growers are starting to pay more attention to that than they ever have before, and I think that's a really essential key to this puzzle. And then again, I just wanted to show you Ka'u for comparison. They have a lot of other different varieties out there, a lot of shorter, higher yielding varieties that just have a higher number of leaves per branch. So they started out probably more like 25 leaves per branch prior to CLR. They've dropped down to maybe about 20 in 2022. And now you can see this year, they're getting pretty hard hit. They're down to like 10 or 15 leaves per branch. So I think this is going to be a year of reckoning for the Ka'u growers. They are also in a bad situation because they have more of a year-round harvest, which means they cannot apply things like Reaxor because that has to be applied at least 45 days before harvest. And if they are harvesting year-round, that pretty much makes it impossible for them to do that. We have also been following dispersal of spores across the island. So at the 15 farms that we have been collecting data, we have these different passive and active samplers set up. So they just blow in the wind and we catch the spores on these greased slides, and we take them back to the lab for molecular identification. And then we come up with some calculations to where we can actually extrapolate a number of spores that are blowing in the air. What's really cool is that it looks like there is a really close trend between numbers of spores that are blowing around and CLR incidence. And you can see that in this graph. The green line shows incidence, and the yellow bars are spores per rep. And so you can see as the spores per rep go up, so does incidence. The first part of the graph in 2022, we really didn't have many samplers out. So that's why those numbers don't correspond very well. But as we get into August, that's when we really started to have good coverage, typically 4 samplers per farm. So we had really nice coverage across these different farms across Kona, Ka'u, and Hilo. And we are now seeing that trend. And again, it's this sort of U-shaped curve, starts high, low in the summer, increases again. What is also striking about this is that you see hundreds of spores per rep, and this is quite low when we think about other rusts, things like wheat rusts, soybean rusts. Those have very, very high wind dispersal amounts, like in the hundreds of thousands. So when we started putting these samplers out, at first we thought we weren't catching anything, but it was really that our detection levels were set too high and we couldn't detect these low levels of spores that were blowing around. So now we have figured out how to detect these low levels, and sure enough, we are picking them up. Spores are really sticky and they clump together, and they actually don't blow in the wind that well compared to these other rusts, but obviously they're blowing around enough to where we are picking them up in our samplers. So I think the moral of this story is that they probably aren't being blown very far distances. It's probably more within farms that we're getting this movement. And occasionally when we get stronger wind storms, we might be seeing spores disperse further across the landscape. But I think most of this is really localized dispersal. And again, this is probably why we see incidents go up during the harvest. You have pickers out there working. Again, the spores are really sticky. They're sticking to everything, to their clothes, to their hands, and they're being moved from one tree to the next. So I think wind dispersal is important, certainly within farms, but I also think that human-mediated dispersal is critical, and that's part of why we see these numbers go up right about now. People are moving around in the farms more than they normally are. So now I want to start to get into some of the management options. And I just wanted to give this overview first before I get into the data, because I think these points are really important to keep in mind. And Suzanne and Melanie have been working really hard on getting some really easy to read flyers out to everybody. And I'm sure that you've seen these, and this is kind of the same message. I think first and foremost, you want to focus on cultural controls, and that includes pruning and sanitation. So the weeds on your farm are going to compete with the trees for nutrients. So that is why you need to keep the weeds down. It's also going to make spraying and fertilizing a lot easier. Desuckering is critical because, again, those also compete with nutrients, and those newer branches that are coming out are really susceptible to rust. Those are the ones that you normally see really active germination on. So it's important to desucker at least a couple times a year, if not more. The pruning, I'm going to show you some data here on the next slide and get into why maybe Kona style might not always be the best option. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is that you don't want your trees to be very dense in terms of foliage. You want the branches to be well aerated. You want wind to be able to move through there. You don't want a lot of self-shading going on, which is what can happen when you have a dozen different verticals, which is not uncommon. We go to a lot of farms and we might see 6, 8, 10 verticals, and the rust is out of control on those farms. You really want to aim for, if you're going to use Kona style, 3 to 4 verticals, I think is probably ideal. And again, it comes down to limiting the microclimate that rust really thrives in. You want to keep it open, keep the sunlight in, and let the wind blow through. The third point I have there is annual testing of your soil and leaf tissue. This is critical so that you can detect nutrient deficiencies on your farm. You cannot fertilize your trees properly if you don't know what they are missing. And I'm going to show some data on this as well. And we're actually going to go through some examples of what your soil and leaf tissue analysis might look like, because I realize that this is a huge black hole and there's not good information for interpreting this data. So we're going to go over a couple together. And then last, but certainly not least, you need to be out in your fields monitoring regularly, at least monthly, looking for these really orange powdery spores. And so that's what you are seeing up at the top. It says active sporulation. When you see that, you want to start taking action, whether that's pruning and spraying, but certainly it's time to do something if you're seeing a lot of that on your farm. The picture next to that is really important too, because you're going to monitor not only to be able to tell when to spray, but you also want to monitor after you spray so that you can determine if your sprays were effective or not. This picture shows an effective spray. It's really dried up looking. There's no bright orange spores. So I think this is really characteristic after something like Preaxor or Badge or Oxidate is sprayed. You get these really dried up looking lesions. So keep in mind that this is what you're going to be looking for if your spray was effective or not. And then again, back to the fungicides. So I think kind of just a good baseline, if you do your monitoring using something like the 30 tree method, which I think you're probably all familiar with CBD, you can do that same sort of thing to monitor CLR. Pick 25 trees throughout your farm, just kind of zigzag and sample branches throughout your farm so you can see where the hot spots are and you can see if you need to spray or not. If you are at less than 5% incidence, I think using preventatives would be good. We have several biological-based fungicides that are available for use. That includes Serenade and double nickel are probably a couple of the most common. These are bacteria-based fungicides. The Badge and Coside copper-based fungicides are also excellent to use if you have low incidence. They work really, really well. If you are above 5%, I think it's time to start looking at curatives. Unfortunately, all we have right now is Preaxor. It is a translaminar, meaning that the fungicide makes contact with the leaf and then it moves throughout that leaf. It doesn't move through the whole plant, so coverage is still really important. You still need to hit the leaf with that fungicide, okay? Same with the preventatives. You have to hit the leaves in order for these things to work. And you have to hit the underside, which we know can be really tricky. So the kind of sprayer that you use, the rate that you use, the volume of water that you use, all these things really, really matter for making these sprays effective. And I'm happy to answer questions on those sorts of things at the end here. Bottom line, focus on pruning, sanitation, and fertilizing first. And only after you have those things under control should you start to think about adding fungicides into your toolbox. I think plant health and cultural controls are very important. And if you don't do those things first, you could be wasting a lot of time and money doing these fungicide sprays. Okay, I think if you were at one of the last talks I gave, you probably saw this slide before, but I wanted to show it again. We don't have any data from this year. This is data from last year, and it's on pruning style and CLR incidence. What's interesting is that the Kona style of pruning seems to have much higher incidence than some of these other types of pruning, namely Beaumont Fukunaga, block stumping, and umbrella or topping. The reason I think this probably has to do a lot with the inoculum that you're leaving on your farm. When you do block stumping or Beaumont Fukunaga, you're essentially removing leaves, right? You're removing that inoculum from your farm. You're starting with a clean slate. Kona style, you've got many verticals on all your trees. It can create a dense wall of foliage. And again, we're going back to that, a lot of self-shading, limited airflow, and you're not removing any inoculum. You just have this dense wall of foliage. With the umbrella and the topping, it's a little bit odd. I actually was surprised to see this result, but again, it's a small number of farms and we really need more data to be sure that this is a true trend. But it could be that when you top your tree, you're getting a lot of growth sent back down into the laterals, and that could be giving some protection to the tree. It's possible. But again, I expected that this really bushy type of tree might cause CLR to grow more because it's dark and it's limited airflow, but that's not what we've seen so far. But again, we need to look at more farms, so we're in the process of collecting more data on this year, and hopefully I'll have some new data to show you on this next year. We've also been doing island-wide surveys of coffee soils and plant nutrition. Again, a key component of managing CLR is getting your nutrition correct. So the top graph is just soil, and then the bottom graph is the leaf tissue, and the x-axis is percent of farms sampled. So we sampled around 20 farms in 2022 and 2023. The blue bars show toxic levels of a nutrient, and the yellow bars show deficient levels of a nutrient. The thing that jumps out to me is that in the soil, a lot of farms had deficiencies, but a lot of farms also had very high levels of different nutrients, namely manganese, calcium, and phosphorus, but some of these others as well. But if you look at the leaf tissue, we mostly are seeing deficiencies. So there's this sort of mismatch. High levels in the soil for a lot of farms and low levels in the leaf tissue. And I'm going to talk more about this in the next slide. We also have been looking at soil pH, which is in the literature also very important for CLR. It seems to thrive in really acidic soils. So you want your soil acidity to be between around 5.5 to 6.5, somewhere in there is probably pretty good. So maybe about 50% of our farms had soil pH that was in that range. About 30 to 40% of the farms we sampled were too acidic, and maybe 5 to 10% were on the basic side. So again, I think telling you that you need to sample your soils and leaf tissue every year is one thing, and that's great. And I think most people are willing to do that, but then asking you to interpret what you're seeing is a whole nother beast. And there's not good interpretation guides out there for growers. It's a huge black hole that we need to address. So that's one of the things I'm hoping will come out of this island-wide sampling, is that we'll get enough data from enough different farms that we'll be able to start seeing some trends. And we'll be able to come up with a guide that's really easy to read for growers that they can look at and say, oh, my farm fits right into this category, and these are the things that I need to apply, and this is when, the number of times, here's the locally available fertilizers, on and on. But I wanted to go through a couple of these with you here, just so you have an idea of maybe what to look for when you get your results back from these analyses. So I wanted to show you one from low elevation and one from high elevation. So the top one from low elevation, a couple things jump out at me. There in the orange, you see that a lot of the different elements are quite high. They are in fact toxic levels in the soil. However, when you look at the leaf tissue, you see that there's a lot of deficiencies. So again, this is like the previous slide that I talked about, where there's this mismatch. Why are the levels so high in the soil, but they're so low in the leaf tissue? I think it's important to keep in mind that this is a low elevation farm. It is probably in drought conditions at least part of the year. We know that all the farms in Kona have root knot nematode, which damage your root systems. And so I think what's happening here is that growers are applying fertilizer pretty regularly, and those levels are building up in the soil, but the plants are not able to uptake these nutrients. They're just kind of sitting there in the soil unused. And this is probably not just because of drought and not just because of low soil acidity in some cases, but a big part of it is probably to do with root knot nematode and root damage. And so even though the nutrients might be there and you might be doing a good job of applying this granular fertilizer, the plants aren't able to take all of that up. So how do we overcome this? I think foliar fertilization is a great thing to add into your repertoire. If you're at low elevations and you have irrigation lines, you could also start to irrigate more often. But I think the key here is really foliar fertilization and micronutrients, which you also see on the right-hand side. The iron, the manganese, the copper, the zinc, they're all really low in the trees. So foliar fertilizations can help to correct this. And you don't want to keep adding these granular fertilizers to your soil because, again, they're already at toxic levels and the plants can't take them up anyway. So we want to avoid adding anything else to these really toxic levels in the soil. If we look at high elevations, we see a different sort of a scenario. We know at high elevations, we get a lot more rain. So there's a lot more leaching of fertilizers, right? And that's exactly what we see here. We see low levels of nutrients in the soil and in the leaf tissue. Part of this could be that there's just not enough fertilizer being added, but I think a big part of this has to do with rainfall. The other thing I wanted to point out is that these soils are too acidic. You can see it's around 5, which is about a point too low. And then we also see aluminum toxicity in the soil, and this is linked to that low pH. We also are seeing copper toxicity at this farm, and that is because this grower was trying to do a great job of applying fungicides, but used copper, I think it was Kocide, maybe 6 or 7 times last year, and it sent his copper levels through the roof. So we switched that up and got his copper levels back down by adding in biologicals and also Preaxor instead of just using copper sprays. We have also added in foliar fertilizers to try to correct some of those deficiencies that he's seeing. And then he's also adding dolomite to try to increase his soil pH. So I'm happy to take a look at soil and tissue analyses if you have them and are scratching your head as to how to interpret them. I'm by no means an expert, but I am in the process of learning. And I would be happy to go through your results with you and try to get some answers if this is all a huge puzzle. So just to reiterate, plant nutrition is critical for CLR management. There are 17 essential elements that are needed for healthy coffee plants, and it's important that those are balanced. We need them to be balanced so that you can strengthen your plant's physiological defenses. We're in the process of planning several greenhouse and field trials where we're going to be looking at different rates of macro and micronutrients and their effects on CLR. Some that have been pointed out in the literature from South America that seem to be really important, nitrogen and potassium, as well as zinc, manganese, and boron. These are just some of the nutrients that are probably important, and these are just some of the functions that they do. And so we're trying to encourage most of the growers we work with to add micronutrients into their fertilization regime. If you are not doing that already, and if you don't already have a good source, Cafedac and tropical metasolate are good sources that are locally available. They are imported, so that's not great, and we would love to have some non-imported sources. But for now, if you're struggling to find something, I know that these are available and they work well. You can rotate them monthly. I think that's one of the best ways that we have found to incorporate them into a fertilizer regime. And I'm happy to talk more on this at the end as well. And then getting into some chemical controls. So we looked at different fungicide strategies on 30 different farms last year. 8 of these farms were only using preventative. So these are, again, things like your Serenade, Kocide, Double Nickel, Badge. 9 farms were using a preventative plus Problad, which is a botanical-based fungicide. And then 13 farms were using a preventative plus Preaxor, which is that translaminar systemic that I mentioned. You can see that the results are pretty striking. Farms that used either only preventatives or only preventatives plus Problad ended the season at around 40% incidence. The farms that used preventatives plus Preaxor ended the season at around 3% incidence. So pretty striking results, and this led us to begin a fungicide trial this season, looking a little bit deeper at this question. So we have 2 farms in Kona and 2 farms in Ka'u and 1 in Hilo. We picked out 2 different copper-based fungicides, 2 different biologicals, Preaxor, and then we also wanted to look at Problad Verde. And one of the farms was organic, and so we couldn't apply Preaxor there. And so instead, we decided to throw in Cafedac. It's not a fungicide, it's a fertilizer, but we thought, why not? Let's just see what happens if you only apply fertilizer instead of applying a fungicide. So on the x-axis, we have weeks. So W0 is week 0. That's before we sprayed anything. So we took baseline incidence, and you can see it was above 5%, maybe around 8–10% for most of the plots. At week 1, we did our first spray. So each treatment plot got one of these different fungicides. There was a treatment plot that just got Cocide, one that just got Badge, one got Serenade, one got Double Nickel, so on and so forth. We had 2 Preaxor treatments, and the difference between these is that one of the treatment plots only got 1 application, and one of the treatment plots got 2 applications that were only 3 weeks apart. So we wanted to see, because the label, if you've read the Preaxor label, it suggests that you make 2 Preaxor applications 3 weeks apart, which sounded a little bit odd to us. We can only apply it 2 times throughout the whole season here in Hawaii, that you would want to group those together so closely. So we wanted to see if that indeed was more effective than spreading them out. So again, after the first spray, you can see that Preaxor in the purple was very effective. It knocked the incidence all the way down to around 1%. The 2 copper products and the biologicals went down to maybe about 5% or so. Problad did not work that great. It actually went up. And CafeDAC was right around 5%. We continued to monitor up through week 5, where we did another application of the same fungicide in each plot, and then took data again at week 6. So results from this first 5-week trial, the 2 copper products worked pretty similarly and ended at about 5%. The 2 biologicals looked pretty similar at about 8%. Problad and CafeDAC ended pretty similarly at about 8 to 10%, and Preaxor was clearly the winner, down at 1%. So we didn't want to just do these 2 applications and then leave the farmers to sort of fend for themselves for the rest of the season. So we decided to continue on this project in a rotation program. So I'm showing you the results from one farm using this rotation program. So initial infection before we did any sprays was 14%. This was back in April. We did 3 different spray schemes. So I showed you the first 5 weeks there. And this first set of bars on the far left-hand corner, it shows 2 sprays of the preventative, and then we did 1 spray of Preaxor. The next treatment group, we did 2 sprays of Preaxor 3 weeks apart, which I previously mentioned, and then we did a second treatment of 2 Preaxor sprays, but they were 8 weeks apart. So one thing you can gather from this graph, which most of you have probably already recognized, that bottom and mid part of the canopy in your trees tends to have higher incidence than the top part. Okay, that's not mind-blowing. I think we all know that. The more interesting thing on this graph is that the 2 Preaxor sprays that were very close together didn't perform as well as the 2 Preaxor sprays that were 2 months apart. The 2 Preaxor sprays that were 2 months apart also did better than the 2 preventatives plus 1 Preaxor spray. So all 3 spray schemes worked pretty well. They all resulted in less than 5% incidence, but the 2 Preaxors spaced 2 months apart was the winner. I also think that the 2 preventatives plus Preaxor is a good technique if you were going to carry this all the way through the end of the season. For example, this farm actually just did another application of Serenade. So now they've done 3 preventative sprays and 1 Preaxor spray. And this may be enough to carry them through to the end of the season. So that would be 4 sprays in a season, 3 preventatives and 1 Preaxor. And right now they're doing great. They're less than 5% on the whole farm. So it's just different things to think about what you want your rotation program to be, but it should look something like this. If you are a conventional farm and are able to spray Preaxor, I think you can go for it. We're seeing great results with it, and you should get about 8 weeks of protection with this product. If you're using any of the preventatives, they generally have 4 to 5 weeks of protection, so you would alternate those with the Preaxor. And really, you should only have to spray it maybe 4 or 5 times total to get good protection throughout the whole season. Okay, that was what I wanted to share with on CLR for now. I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing on CVB because I think it's important not to forget about this pest. We still have to deal with it, even though we now have to deal with CLR too. And many of you, I think, were probably at some point involved in the area-wide coffeeberry borer monitoring program, which I had been working on for quite a number of years. And so this is one of the last papers to come out of that project. And I really was interested in how we can optimize location-specific pesticide applications. I say pesticides only because there are things like pyrethrin, like the pyranol, and also that spinetoram, pesticides that are approved for Hawaii. But really, I think what most people are applying is the Bovaria. So, you can just think of this as when to best time my Bovaria sprays. So we all know that Hawaii Island has really different weather, and farmers use different management practices, and the coffee plant phenology varies from farm to farm. So I've always felt like it's a little bit silly that we have one set of recommendations for all of the growers on this island, given that we have such different conditions from farm to farm. So I was really interested in how these different factors affect the population dynamics of CBD across this really varied landscape. And I wanted to see if we could combine all of this monitoring data to be used and develop a location-specific spray schedule for each location. So we collected data from 14 farms on Hawaii Island over a period of 3 years. Basically what we found, temperature, rainfall, and humidity are all significantly different across the different districts and elevations. Not surprising, I'm sure all of you know that. We found larger CBD populations at low elevations, and we also found higher fruit production at low and mid elevations. So a lot of this has to do with, no big surprise, temperature. Temperature is the driving force for a lot of the differences that we see both in the CBD populations and in the coffee plant phenology. We also saw that the timing of fruit development and harvest differs. Again, you as growers know this. Your low and mid elevation farms, your harvest begins before your high elevation farms. There's quite a significant lag there. So all of these things come into play when you're thinking about your spray schedules. We found that infestation is driven by pest pressure, fruit availability, and temperature. So these three graphs just show on the far left, as you increase your trap catch, so your pest pressure, your infestation also goes up. That makes sense. As your berries per branch decreases, your infestation actually increases. Okay, so if you think about the beginning of the season, you have very few berries on your trees, but most of them are infested. And that's why it's really important to go through and do that pre-harvest sort of sanitation pick at least a couple times a year, because most of that fruit, when there's very few fruits available and there's a lot of CBD flying around, those berries are going to be infested. So it's important to remove them. And then lastly, we see, again, temperature is driving infestation, and that has to do with the populations of CBD. They develop faster as temperatures increase. So at low elevations, you can get 4 to 5 generations of CBD, whereas at high elevations, you might only get 2 or 3. So the pest pressure is very different at these different elevations, and it differs across the districts as well. So this is an example spray schedule that I came up with based on flight activity, fruit production, infestation, and AB position. If you've read the extension recommendations, they have a table in there that tells you sort of how to figure out if you should spray or not. But that is just based on infestation and AB position, and it actually doesn't take into account the populations of CBD, how large they are, and how much fruit you have on the trees. And I think that's critical information to deciding whether or not you should be spraying. So you can look at this table as sort of like a heat map. As the colors increase towards red, that is the times that are more and more critical to spray. So for example, if you are a low elevation Kona farm, you could spray anywhere from 4 to 7 times in a given season. The orange and the red boxes are times when you absolutely should be spraying. The yellow boxes are sort of optional, and the white boxes, you probably don't need to spray. And you can see that the recommendation differs for each elevation and for each district, because it takes into account all of this information that we've been collecting over the last 3 years. So I would be curious to hear in the Q&A if these spray schedules make sense to you based on your location. If you're at a mid or a high elevation, you should be spraying fewer times. You should only have to spray 3 or 4 times, if even that. If you're a high elevation Ka'u grower, you might only have to spray 1 time. And that could be much later in the season, all the way out in August, instead of the very beginning of the season, which is generally what we've been told, is to front load our sprays early in the season. But I think that's actually not correct. I think that you need to take into account the weather and the pest pressure and your fruit availability to tell you if you should be spraying or not. So again, interested to hear your comments on whether or not you feel like this would work for your farm. But the next slide that I have gets into a question that I get asked a lot, because I think that the word is on the street that we are looking at releasing a biocontrol for coffee berry borer. This has been in the works for some time. There was a cultural assessment that was done, and it took quite a long time to get approved. It's finally been approved, and we have permits now to import these and eventually to release them. This biocontrol is a very tiny parasitoid wasp. It's originally from Africa, where it's pretty widespread. The wasp is about half the size of the coffee berry borer, and you can see that the great thing about it is that it attacks the adults, and it will attack them not only in the AV position before they've entered the berry, but it will actually go into the berry after the female and parasitize it inside the berry before it gets to the bean. So it has the potential to be a great biocontrol, not only because of that, but because it has very high host specificity. It primarily will go after coffee berry borer and also tropical nut borer, which is another scolited pest that we have here. So that's fantastic news. Currently, we are trying to do CBB mass rearing at PBARC. So we have started to prepare this diet and then collect CBB from the wild, trying to get them to breed and survive in captivity, which is harder than it sounds. Coffee berry borer carries a lot of fungus on its body, and so in order for us to get these colonies up and thriving, we have to sanitize the CBB, so basically dip them in alcohol or bleach. And so it's a time-consuming process, and they could still be carrying fungus in their bodies. And so we're only in the early stages, but I think we're going to make some pretty good progress here in the next few months. Once we get the colony established, a few generations in, we're going to start accepting shipments from Colombia of these parasitoid wasps, and then we'll be rearing the parasitoid wasps on our CBB that are in colony. So you could expect that we could be doing these experimental releases as soon as next fall. If the government doesn't get shut down, I'm supposed to go to Colombia next Saturday to see their rearing setup there at Sena Cafe. So fingers crossed, this is potentially the third time our trip might get canceled, but hopefully that's not the case and we get to go so that we can learn from some of the experts there how they are doing these releases. The other thing I've been working on is using technology to improve the way that we farm. Drones are nothing new for row crops, but it's something that really hasn't been used much for orchard crops, at least not here in Hawaii. Really nobody's spraying anything from drones. It's been really difficult to get permits to do that. We are still in the process of trying to get ours. But I think it's important to not only think about using these drones for fungicides, but really for fertilizers and for arbovaria sprays too. Labor is such a limiting issue for us that if we could overcome needing to hire people and needing to put on these backpack sprayers in this really rocky terrain, I think it would be a real game changer for our industry. So we have this drone. We are in the early stages of testing out the optimal parameters that we would use to spray these different products. We're looking at how high we need to fly, the speed, the flow rate, the coverage, drift, all these different things that we need to optimize before we actually move to products. So right now we're just using water and dye. And then we're going to be working on some economic comparisons. You know, is this really going to be feasible for growers based on the time, the labor, and the amount of product that they would be using with a drone versus with a backpack or a tractor sprayer? Oh, and I have a little video. You can see the drone in action. It releases quite a high volume, and if you look at the trees, it's not a great view, but you can kind of see them moving around, and it's kind of amazing how powerful the spray is. It hits all the way to the ground, and it really rotates the spray. And watching it is what made me think that it could potentially be useful for CLR. If we can get a powerful enough spray and optimize the flow rate and the coverage, it's possible that we could get up and under the plant and start to do some of these fungicide applications. But I think even if that doesn't work, I think this would be fantastic for foliar sprays and for arbovaria as well. The other precision technology sort of thing that we've been working on for a long time has been the best beans monitoring app, but we've sort of moved beyond that and are looking more at artificial intelligence and how we can use this technology to improve the way that we farm. So we always say when we're out in the field, wouldn't it be great if you could snap a picture of a pest or a disease or a nutrient deficiency when you're in the field and instantly get an identification and a recommendation for how to treat that pest or disease or deficiency? And that technology, it's available. This machine vision learning, it's not very difficult. We have the capabilities to do that. And so we are working on building a photo library right now. We're going to curate it for all of these different pests and diseases and deficiencies that we see in our coffee here in Hawaii. We're going to build that database and we're going to train this machine vision model so that we can identify these, put them into the app. The grower goes and takes a picture and gets an instant identification and recommendation for what these things are. I think this is going to be critical for kind of the early detection of any new pests and diseases that we get, but also for better understanding the whole plant health aspect. If we could identify what these deficiencies are in the field, instead of just, waiting on our soil and tissue results, that would be fantastic. So we're really excited about this and are kind of in the early stages, but building momentum pretty quickly. That is all I have for you today. I thank all of you for contributing to this work over many, many years, since all the way back in 2017. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. You are welcome to submit questions to the chat or chime in.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa. This is Carolyn Wickover.
Hey, Carolyn.
This was a great update. I do have a question.
Sure.
It goes back to the monitoring. It looks like, you said to use the preventatives if we're less than 5%, but that's going to tend to be earlier in the season.
Mm-hmm.
But when the incidence is higher is when we would use Priaxor, but that's later in the season, and we really couldn't use Priaxor at that time because we're so close to harvest. So in a way, it seems like, are there times that we even, is there a possibility that we don't need to apply anything, and that just through proper sanitation and and pruning methods, would that be enough?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Carolyn. And that is ultimately my hope, that we progress so far in our understanding of cultural control methods and in plant health that we don't need to apply any of these nasty chemicals. That's really what I'm striving towards. I don't love to tell people that they should apply things like Priaxor. Really, where I think that they can come in handy, I'll give you an example. We had a grower, it was very high elevation, I think around 600 meters in Kona. He had a horrible last 2 years. High elevations, your production's already fairly low. And then he lost 75% of that already low production. And so he basically had no coffee to sell. He ended the year at 75% infection, which hasn't been uncommon really for growers at all elevations in Kona. He was pretty devastated and asked what he could do. And this was I think it was late November. He had already harvested the very few berries that were available to harvest. So harvest time wasn't an issue. And he was able to go in and spray Priaxor. It's what we recommended as a knockdown, really, so that he could start the season sort of fresh, because he didn't want to stump his entire farm. He did end up stumping maybe 20% of the trees that were pretty old or unproductive, but the rest that were still, younger and in pretty good health, he wanted to go in and try to knock down what was there instead of pruning everything, stump pruning everything. So he applied it in late November, and by, I think, 2 weeks later, we saw a huge difference. I'm going to go back up to this. So this picture on the top right is what we saw after we applied that Priaxor just 2 weeks later. His whole farm looked like the picture on the left before we sprayed. It was really active sporulation. He had already lost a ton of leaves. At least I would say half of the leaves on his farm were gone by that point. So he was in a pretty dire situation. I really feel like spraying the Preaxor when he did pretty much saved him for the following season. It knocked it all the way down to like 12%, which is amazing after he was at 75% before that. So I think it could be used in that sense. And then he was able to spray again, I think, I want to say in May of this year. And that was the only 2 times he sprayed it. And then he's alternated with preventatives, you know, between there, and his farm's in good shape this year. He's going to have a pretty decent year. The biggest thing for us was not that he would get back to pre-CLR production levels just yet, but that we wanted to see a lot of really healthy leaves on his trees, and that's exactly where we're at. We've spent a lot of time working with him on the fertilization because that was also a huge issue for him. I think he had applied the same coffee special granular fertilizer ever since he's had that farm, like twice a year in these large doses. That wasn't working well. So we changed the fertilizer regime into smaller doses spread throughout the year for those granular fertilizers. We added in Cafe DAC and tropical metasolate into these monthly rotations for the foliar sprays to get the micronutrients up. And then we started to alternate this rotation of not just the Preaxor, but the preventatives. And it really turned his whole farm around. So to get at your question of, you know, is the beginning of the season the only time to apply Preaxor, or rather close to harvest? You could, in this instance, apply it at the very end of the year if you've had a horrible year and help knock it back down so that you start the year in a better place. But for a lot of farms, once a year may be enough. As I showed you from these other results, you know, this first group of bars here on the left, that was just one application of Preaxor, and he's at 3%. He won't need to apply it again. And that was applied, you know, July 27th, so more than 45 days out before harvest. So I'd like to say that eventually maybe we can get to the point where we won't have to use things like Preaxor, and maybe we could just use preventatives, or ultimately maybe we can just focus on cultural controls and plant health. But I think for most farms, we're not quite there yet. So it's really about keeping the trees alive at this point. And so again, before applying any fungicides, I think it is critical to get the whole pruning down, and to get the weed control down, and to get the fertilization regime figured out. And fungicides should really just be there to fill in the gaps. At least that's how I feel about it.
Melissa, I don't know if you see the chat.
Nope. Let's see.
So I think several people maybe have that question, which is, could you go through the high, low, medium, and
right. Okay.
application numbers?
I know, I always think in meters.
It's fine.
So low is 200 to 400 meters, mid is 400 to almost 600 meters, and then anything above 600 meters is high. Can we access the slides after the meeting? Yes, of course. There might be a way. Do you have a KCFA website, Kohlhauer, that this could be posted to? Or we could also share a link with people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I recorded it.
Oh, right. Okay, great. So let me do some quick math here. What is 1,250 feet in meters?
It's in the medium.
Oh, okay, right. 381. Yeah, so that's what we would call low.
Yeah. It's right on the edge, but yeah.
Yeah, right on the edge. Okay, let's see. What is the treatment interval for foliar micronutrients? Again, I think it's really critical to look at your leaf and soil analyses first before you try to figure out how many times you need to fertilize and what. But in general, I think you could even go monthly with these micronutrients, just based on the results that we've seen, which is pretty much everybody is low in these micronutrients all the time. I don't think it could hurt, but you should definitely get your analyses done and just verify that that's the case. I think those two things that I mentioned, the cafe DAC and the tropical metasolate, only differ by a couple different things. I think one of them has magnesium and the other one has manganese. But I think they both have zinc and iron, molybdenum, a couple other things. Okay, Kathy, we are using a low power 80 PSI sprayer and don't know if we are successful at applying the fungicide to all parts of the leaves. Do you know if there are people that can come and apply Preaxor with high powered sprayers for hire? That's a good question. I do not know of anyone spraying for hire. I will say that for this trial that I'm showing you results for here, we did all these sprays with a backpack sprayer, just a good old fashioned steel 4-gallon backpack sprayer. It was hard work, but it's possible. We got really good coverage on all the leaves. And so it's definitely possible with a backpack sprayer. You don't necessarily need a high powered, blast sprayer to do these applications. I think what's really important if you're going to use the backpack sprayer is get the product really well mixed first and foremost. So we were filling our tanks up halfway with water, mixing the solution in a separate bucket with water, and then pouring everything together and then mixing it. They also have those backpack sprayers that have the built-in agitator, which would be even better. We just shook them up really well. Figuring out your rate is really important too. So we were using the medium rate. So on the labels, they normally will give you sort of this range, right? A low and a high. And we were just kind of picking the medium, and that seemed to work well. And then the last thing that's really important if you're spraying with backpack sprayer is your nozzle. So when you buy those steel sprayers or whatever other sprayers you're buying, you should get a few different nozzle heads that come with it. And we found that the nozzle that had an angle upwards was ideal for spraying fungicides because you want to get up underneath the plant. It also comes with one that kind of sprays out in all directions. That one didn't work too well. And then it came with one, I think, that sprays in both directions, up and down, and that seemed to waste a lot of product. So again, if you're going to use a backpack sprayer, or I'm not sure about blast sprayers, but they probably have different nozzles too, but you want to use one that kind of shoots up and underneath the plant if possible. That seemed to make a big difference in coverage. I hope that helps. You're welcome to jump in if that did not answer your question. Can you say something about twig borer beetle? Seems a lot worse for us at a low elevation farm. Unfortunately, before CLR came, black twig borer was the next pest on our list of things to tackle, and CLR has kind of taken over all of our research recently. But it's still on our list. Black twig borer, as you know, is difficult to control because once it goes into the branch, you can't kill it. So the only recommendations that they have is to remove that branch. You can't spray it with anything at that point. It's also not very well attracted to traps. So figuring out when it's flying, and when would be an ideal time to control for it. It's also very difficult because they don't seem to be attracted to any of the lures that we have. So this is certainly something that we need to figure out. Definitely, it seems to be a worse problem than CBB for a lot of farms, especially if you have a lot of other like nut and fruit trees, or if you're close to like an agroforestry edge, then you might see a lot more black twig borer than someone that's kind of in a bigger open space. So I'm sorry, I don't have any insight into black twig borer right now, but it's certainly on our list of things to research. We haven't forgotten about it. It's just been a little delayed. I think I answered all the questions in the chat. You're welcome to jump in again by voice if you would rather, or chat's fine too.
Yeah, pretty soon we need to wrap up too, but I had a question with in
Yeah.
your presentation that I think is interesting to me, but I think that I don't know if it's going to be answerable. But you
Sure.
refer to what you called a pattern in Kona of CLR incidents and even CB, even in your graphs with CBB, you talked about essentially patterns and identifying these patterns. But what I've heard, more generally and over time is that you have good years and bad years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'd like you to address how a quote unquote pattern relates to the, if you look internationally at coffee over time, like many decades, people are like, well, we had a couple bad years or we had a couple good, etc. How does those things relate to each other?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I was trying to scroll up and go back to that slide. Let's see if I can reshare here so I can get back to the slide that you were talking about. Huh, it doesn't want to let me move up. That's odd. Okay, we'll just have to imagine it. Yeah, we had that sort of U-shaped pattern. And it's honestly the same pattern that we've seen with CBB too, right? Starts out pretty high in the year, low through the summer months, increases during harvest. That's generally what I'm talking about when I say pattern, but you're very right in that there will be good years and bad years. If I was able to go back to that slide, I could show you that 2023 is sort of in between our really bad year, which was 2022, and 2021, which was our not so bad year. So we're kind of coasting right in between that bad year and okay year. And I think a lot of that has to do with production, which is what you're getting at, Ka'u. You're gonna have years of low production and years of high production. So this year, everybody seems to have recovered a little bit over the previous year and their production's a little bit higher. So our incidence is also looking like it's gonna be a little higher than last year. So they sort of go hand in hand. I think part of the reason that we're having a better year is not just because of weather. Certainly that plays a factor. But I think a lot of it is management too. Like I said, people seem to have started to figure out the formula to prevent all that horrible defoliation that we saw the year prior. So yeah, there's certainly patterns in the biology of the disease, but then there's also these different patterns in production, right? When you have bad years and good years. So I think that part will be less predictable because it depends on the age of your trees, their health, the fertilizers you're using, your elevation, and then the biology of the disease will probably follow that. If you're having really high production, your incidence will probably be high that year too. At least that's what the literature seems to suggest. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any final questions before we wrap up, folks? Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the invite.
Yeah, I think seems like people were got from this plenty, so I think it was very useful.
Good. Yeah, I think I think it's good to share this stuff more regularly at different parts of the season so people can kind of start to think about things that they might want to change. Yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done on figuring out the fertilization and figuring out fungicide sprays and all of that stuff. And hopefully we just keep learning a little bit more and more as time goes on. But yeah, I think we're starting to get some good data and starting to see folks implement some of these things that we've talked about and getting some good results. So yeah, it's encouraging.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you all for attending, and thank you again for being here for us. And like Carolyn said, hopefully we'll get this up on the website so that it's accessible to people to review and or people who weren't able to make it.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you so much. It was really great to see you all.
Yeah, you too.
Thank
Thanks,
you, Melissa.
everybody.
Thank you. Take care. Aloha.
Bye.